last thing Alara Vance did before leaving New York was fire someone. David Chen, Chief Marketing Officer of Ether Dynamics, had spent 40 minutes presenting a campaign that proposed softening the safety warning language on the company's new electric vehicle. Consumer research, he explained, showed that aggressive safety disclaimers created friction in the purchase decision. Softer language could boost conversion rates by 11%. Alara let him finish. Then she said, "Safety is absolute. There is no gray area." David made the mistake of pushing back. "Every automaker uses similar language, Alara. We're not lying. We're optimizing. Optimizing." She repeated the word the way you'd repeat a diagnosis. "If you can't see the difference between optimizing and lying, this isn't the right fit." The resignation letter was on her desk within the hour. Voluntary, technically. Everyone in the room understood the alternative. That was Monday. By Friday afternoon, Alara was behind the wheel of the Ether X, her company's unreleased prototype, the only one in existence, heading west on I-80 toward Wyoming, alone, with no security detail, no assistant, and a merger proposal from Omnicorp sitting in her briefcase that the board wanted signed by Monday. Her assistant Grace had tried to talk her out of it. "The Weather Service is forecasting a winter storm emergency in the Teton region, Miss Vance. WYDOT is recommending no travel after noon. I'll be through the pass before noon. I've got the most advanced vehicle on the planet, Grace. I'll be fine." She would remember that sentence later, with the particular shame reserved for people who confuse technology with invincibility. The snow started gently at 11:15 a.m. on Teton Pass. Fat flakes drifting through pine trees, almost pretty. By 11:30, it was a wall. Visibility collapsed to 50 feet. The wind hit the car sideways with a sound like tearing fabric. The Ether X's dashboard lit up with warnings. Alara had never seen outside a test lab. The LiDAR sensors, the ones that could normally map 300 meters in every direction, were blind. Ice forming on the housings faster than the heaters could melt it. Autonomous driving disengaged, the car announced. Manual driving recommended. Then the temperature warning. Battery thermal warning. Estimated range reduction 47%. This was a known problem. Lithium-ion batteries lost capacity in extreme cold. Her engineering team was still working on the fix. But this was the prototype, and the prototype didn't have the fix yet, because the woman who insisted on safety standards had driven an unfinished car into a blizzard. At 11:52, the power steering locked. It happened without warning. One moment responsive, the next frozen solid, as if someone had poured concrete into the column. The car slid, the rear wheels lost traction. The cliff edge came toward the passenger window with the quiet inevitability of gravity, and then the airbags fired, and the world went white, then dark. Alara sat in the deflating airbag, breathing hard. Snow was already collecting on the cracked windshield. The dashboard flickered twice and died. She tried the door. Electronic locks. Dead. She reached for her phone. No service, no signal, no heat, no way out. The heater had died with the system, and already she could feel the cold pressing in through the shattered glass, patient and absolute. She could see her breath. Her fingers were going numb. Alara Vance, CEO of a $14 billion technology company, was locked inside a $200,000 glass coffin in the middle of a blizzard that the Weather Service had explicitly told her to avoid. She didn't think about the board meeting she would miss. She didn't think about the Omnicorp merger. She thought about the fact that her emergency contacts were her assistant, her lawyer, and her CFO, and that not one of them would notice she was missing before Monday morning. Not because they didn't care, because there was no one in her life who checked on her at night. She was 34 years old and worth $2 billion and completely, absolutely alone. The cold worked fast. Her eyelids grew heavy. She started to drift. Then she heard it. Not the whisper of an electric motor, but the deep, ugly growl of an old combustion engine. The kind of sound that belonged to machines built before touchscreens existed. Headlights swept through the blizzard. A rusted Ford F-150 that looked like it had survived the Cold War pulled up beside her wrecked car and stopped. A man got out. Broad shoulders, face covered by a balaclava and snow goggles, wearing a parka so patched it looked like it had been through several wars, and had opinions about all of them. He assessed the situation in 3 seconds flat, walked to his truck bed, pulled out a crowbar, and smashed the Ether X's driver's side window in 2 clean strikes. Glass scattered across Alara's lap. Cold air poured in, sharp enough to make her gasp, which was the point. The gasp meant she was still breathing. "My car," Alara managed. "It has GPS tracking. They'll find." "Your tracking's dead," the man said. His voice was low and rough, filtered through the balaclava like gravel through a sieve. "Your battery's dead, your heater's dead, and you're about 20 minutes from joining them. Come on." He didn't wait for permission. He pulled her from the seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd extracted things from difficult places before. Calves from frozen ponds maybe, or vehicles from ditches. She was too cold to resist. The interior of the F-150 hit her like a wall of warmth. The heater was blasting. The cab smelled of engine oil, wood smoke, and beef jerky. The German shepherd in the back seat eyed her with the alert wariness of a dog who took responsibilities seriously. The man climbed in, pulled off his goggles, somewhere around 40, weathered face, several days of stubble, dark hair cut short. His eyes were the only remarkable thing, pale gray, sharp with an intelligence that seemed misplaced in a man driving a truck held together by rust and hope. "Caleb Thorne," he said, not as an introduction but as a fact, the way you'd announce the weather. He put the truck in gear. "I need to call my office," Alara said through chattering teeth. "No signal for 30 miles. Storm took out the cell tower an hour ago." "Then take me to the nearest town. I'll pay you, whatever you want." "Nearest town's closed. He shut down the pass right after I came through." He glanced at her. "What kind of idiot drives a car like that into a blizzard?" The question was so blunt, so completely devoid of the deference she was used to, that Alara almost laughed. "The kind of idiot who built it," she said. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Surprise, maybe. He didn't ask what she meant, he just drove. The cabin was one large room. Wood stove, kerosene lamp, a workbench covered in disassembled machinery, a neatly made bed in the corner, and books. Everywhere. Stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, lined along the kitchen counter. Caleb wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, put a mug of beef broth in her hands, and went back to what he'd apparently been doing before he saved her life. Rebuilding a carburetor at the workbench. Alara drank the broth and let the heat crawl back into her bones. Then she did something she almost never did. She observed without agenda. The books first caught her attention. From her chair, she could read the spines, fluid dynamics, fundamentals and applications, Schneier's applied cryptography, Feynman's lectures on physics, Marcus Aurelius's meditations. This was not the reading list of a farmer. Then she watched his hands. The way he worked on the carburetor, a Holly 4-barrel, she recognized it from her engineering classes, wasn't just competent, it was fluent. He found tolerances by touch that most engineers needed calipers to measure. "Your books," she said. "Fluid dynamics, cryptography, Feynman. People in cabins can read. People in cabins don't usually read graduate-level engineering textbooks." He set down the carburetor and looked at her. Something passed across his face, a weariness deeper than exhaustion. People do all sorts of things when they have reasons to disappear. Before she could respond, the generator died. The lights went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. Alara's breath caught. For a fraction of a second, she was back in the car. Sealed, dark, cold, no way out. The panic hit her chest like a fist. "Hey!" Caleb's voice came from across the room, steady and calm. "Just the generator. Fuel line freezes sometimes. Give me a minute." She heard a match strike. Warm light bloomed from a kerosene lamp. Caleb pulled on his parka and went outside. Through the frost-laced window, she watched the lamp bob through the snow. 7 minutes later, the lights came back on. "How did you fix it that fast?" she asked when he returned. "Fuel line had ice crystals. You heat the line, drain the sediment, prime the pump." He said it the way you describe making toast. Alara watched him hang up his parka. The way he diagnosed the problem without hesitation, the speed from diagnosis to fix. This wasn't a handyman. The way he held a wrench was the way she held a soldering iron. The unconscious grace of 10,000 hours. "Who are you?" she asked. Caleb sat down at the workbench. "I'm a man who lives in a cabin and minds his own business. You should try it sometime." The conversation died there. But Alara didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke, listening to the storm, turning over one sentence like a stone in her pocket. People do all sorts of things when they have reasons to disappear. They were stuck for 2 days. The first morning, Alara woke to the smell of coffee, not the artisanal pour-over she was used to, but the kind made in a percolator on a wood stove, coffee that tasted like it had something to prove. Caleb was at the workbench. Bishop was at his feet. Neither looked up. "Coffee's on the stove," Caleb said. "Milk's in the cooler outside." The domesticity of it, the simple logistics of sharing a morning, felt stranger than the blizzard. When was the last time someone had left coffee for her without it being a task delegated through 3 layers of assistant? She poured a cup and stood by the window. The world outside was white and featureless, every landmark erased. It looked the way her mind felt when she was trying to make a decision she didn't want to make. "I need to get to a phone," she said. "I have a board meeting Monday. People are waiting." "People can wait. You don't understand. I run a company. Your company will survive 2 days without you." Caleb's voice carried the flat patience of a man explaining something obvious. "You won't survive going back out there. I can pay you $10,000. Just get me to." He paused in the middle of adding a log to the stove, looked at her, really looked, for the first time since the rescue. His expression wasn't anger. It was closer to the look a mechanic gives a machine that's been badly maintained. "Your money can't melt a blizzard, princess," he said, and the word princess landed with the precision of a man who had identified her entire world in a syllable. 8-foot drifts. The truck doesn't fly. 48 hours. Make yourself comfortable or don't. Either way, you're staying. Alara opened her mouth, closed it. For perhaps the first time in her professional life, she had absolutely nothing to say. So they settled into the forced intimacy of shared space. Caleb maintained the cabin, the generator, the stove. Alara, after watching him do everything for a full day, announced she was cooking dinner. "Can you cook?" Caleb asked, with the skepticism of a man who'd been feeding himself for 5 years. "I built a $14 billion company. I can make soup." She was useless with the axe, a fact Caleb observed with a silence louder than commentary, but she could make food from canned goods. The stew she assembled from canned tomatoes, dried beans, and a frankly reckless amount of garlic was, by cabin standards, remarkable. Caleb tasted it. His eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, which Alara was learning to interpret as high praise. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "MIT dorm kitchens. When you're an engineering student on a scholarship, you learn to cook or you learn to starve." "Scholarship," he repeated it with genuine surprise. She saw him recalculate something in his head. "My parents ran a hardware store in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I got into MIT on grades and financial aid. The billionaire part came later." It was more than she usually shared with anyone. But the cabin had stripped away the usual scaffolding of titles and net worth and LinkedIn profiles, and honesty felt less risky than performance. Caleb offered something back. "My father was a mechanic. Not by choice, by necessity. He wanted to be an engineer, but there wasn't money for school. So he fixed other people's machines and taught himself from textbooks at night." "Is that where the books came from?" "Some, others I bought myself." A pause. "In a previous life." She waited for more, but the door he'd cracked open closed again. They moved to safer ground. The storm, the stove, whether Bishop was genuinely intelligent or merely an excellent actor. "He understands at least 40 words, Caleb said, "and he judges people within 10 seconds of meeting them." "What did he decide about me?" "He let you sit in his chair. That's the highest honor he gives." "I thought that was your chair." "It was. Bishop overruled me 3 years ago." This was, Alara realized, the most Caleb had said at one time since she'd arrived. The cabin was doing something to both of them, peeling back the professional armor that each had worn so long they'd forgotten it was armor and not skin. On the second evening, after another dinner of canned goods elevated by Alara's MIT survival skills, they sat on opposite sides of the stove with mugs of terrible coffee, and Caleb asked her a question that no one in her professional life had ever thought to ask. "Do you actually like it?" "Like what?" "Running the company. Being the person everyone's afraid of. The glass tower, the security detail, the phone that never stops, the The question was so simple, so unguarded, that it bypassed every defense she'd built. "I like building things," she said slowly. "I like solving problems. I like knowing that the cars I make are safe because I insist on it, even when the board says it costs too much." "That's not what I asked." "No, it wasn't. Sometimes," she said, her voice quieter, "I stand at that window on the 52nd floor and realize that if I disappeared, the first person who'd notice would be my assistant. Not because she doesn't care. She does, Grace is wonderful, but because my 8 a.m. meeting would be empty. That's how they'd know I was gone. Not because someone missed me, because a meeting wouldn't have anyone in it." The confession hung in the warm air, more naked than she'd intended. "I know what that's like," Caleb said. 5 words. No elaboration. No reassurance. Just the recognition of one isolated person seeing another. Bishop sighed heavily from his rug, breaking the moment with the impeccable timing of a dog who had been a therapist in a past life. They almost laughed. The moment passed into something gentler. Later, Caleb offered her the bed. She refused. He shrugged and slept on his cot near the stove. Alara lay in the dark, wrapped in wool that smelled of wood smoke, and thought about the strange arithmetic of human connection. How 2 days in a cabin with a stranger had produced more honest conversation than 7 years in a building full of people who called her by name. She slept soundly for the first time in months. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. Caleb was already outside clearing snow when she woke. "Road should be open by afternoon," he said. "Good," she replied, and meant it, and didn't mean it. They dug out the truck in silence, breath-making twin clouds in the cold air. When they finished, Alara leaned against the truck bed and asked the question that had been building for 2 days. "How do you know the specs of my car?" His jaw tightened. "I told you to drop it." "You described a LiDAR array to the version number. You diagnosed a battery issue my own engineers are still debating. Either you're the most overqualified hermit in Wyoming, or you used to be someone else." Silence. The wrong kind. "When you get back to your life," Caleb said, his voice low and careful, "look into your brake software, version 8.3, before you sign anything with Omnicorp." Alara froze. "How do you know about Omnicorp?" "Because I used to work for them." He picked up the shovel, "and the man who runs it killed my family." He went inside. When the search and rescue helicopter appeared 2 hours later, Grace had activated every emergency protocol. Caleb was gone. The truck, Bishop, everything. On the kitchen table, next to her empty coffee mug, a folded note. 6 words in an engineer's precise handwriting. "Don't trust the new braking system." New York swallowed her back. 6 hours after the helicopter, private jet, SUV, office, concerned executives, a PR story about a planned off-grid retreat. "We're telling the press you were testing the vehicle's winter capabilities," Grace said, handing her fresh espresso and a change of clothes. "Adventurous CEO, that sort of thing." "Fine," Alara said, but her mind was in Wyoming. "The man who runs it killed my family." She let the machinery of her life resume. Meetings, calls, board members who expressed relief that registered as concern but smelled like impatience. And privately, methodically, she began to dig. She started with the Ether X. The engineering team's preliminary report was reassuringly mundane. Extreme weather exceeded the thermal system's parameters, causing cascading failures. A freak event. An act of God. Alara didn't buy it. She waited until the office was empty on a Tuesday night, walked to the server room with her CEO access card, pulled the black box data herself. She was an engineer before she was a CEO. She could read data the way musicians read sheet music. At 11:57 a.m., 5 seconds before her power steering failed, a software command had been executed. Not a malfunction. A command. A deliberate instruction buried in the braking software that simultaneously disabled power steering, killed stability control, and reduced braking to 10%. Someone had turned her car into a weapon, and the code was in the module Ether had licensed from Omnicorp. Don't trust the new braking system. Alara sat in the server room glow, staring at the data, and felt the world rearrange itself around her. She pulled up Aether's legal database, Omnicorp Litigation History Automotive. Buried on page 7, she found it. A wrongful death lawsuit filed 5 years ago. Plaintiff Caleb Thorne, former senior systems engineer, Omnicorp Autonomous Division. Claim: defective braking software caused a fatal accident. The suit alleged Omnicorp CEO Sterling Cross had authorized deployment of untested software to meet a deadline. The suit was dismissed. Key evidence ruled inadmissible, and shortly after, Caleb Thorne was reported dead in a fire aboard his personal boat. The photo in the legal filing was younger, cleaner, wearing a tie instead of a parka. But it was unmistakably the man who had pulled her from a ditch with a crowbar. Caleb Thorne was officially dead, and the man who'd killed him was the same man trying to buy her company. She told no one, not Grace, who would have insisted on security, not Legal, who would have invoked fiduciary duty, not the board, who would have removed her as CEO before she reached the airport. She drove a rental Honda Civic to Wyoming, left her company phone in her desk drawer turned on so anyone tracking it would think she was still in the building, took a burner phone, paid cash. The cabin was empty. Bishop's bowl still by the door, workbench cleared but not packed. He'd seen the helicopter and bolted. Of course, a man who'd spent 5 years dead recognized exposure the way a hunted animal recognized a rifle scope. She drove to Victor, the nearest town, and asked at the gas station. "Big guy? German Shepherd?" said the woman behind the counter. Weather-beaten, 60s, Carhartt vest. "That sounds like Cal. Quiet fella, pays cash. There's a garage in Driggs 20 minutes north. Miller's Auto. He does work there sometimes. Miller's Auto, 3 bays, gravel lot, hand-painted sign." The smell of motor oil and welding flux hit her before she opened the car door. She found him in the 3rd bay, underneath a Chevy Suburban on a hydraulic lift. Only his boots were visible. Bishop lay nearby, chin on paws, and when Alara approached, his tail gave a single cautious wag of recognition. He remembered her. "Good dog." "Cal," the garage owner called, a large man in coveralls who'd pointed her to the right bay. "Lady here for you." The boots shifted. Caleb slid out on a mechanic's creeper, and when he saw her, his face went through a rapid series of changes. Surprise, then fear, then anger, before settling on something cold and guarded. The same wall she'd seen go up in the cabin when she asked about his books, except this time the wall was higher and reinforced with steel. "You shouldn't be here," he said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag that was already more oil than cloth. "You were right about the brakes," she said. The rag in his hand stopped moving. "I pulled the black box data. There's a command in Omnicorp software that disabled my safety systems. It wasn't a malfunction. It was deliberate." He scanned the street outside, calculating exit routes. "Not here." He led her to a back office, cramped metal desk, calendar from 2019 on the wall. He closed the door. "Tell me exactly what you found." She told him everything. The command at 11:47. The disabled systems. The code buried in Omnicorp's module. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "5 years ago," he said, "I was the lead systems engineer on Omnicorp's autonomous driving program. During testing, I found a flaw, not a bug, a feature." He said the word with the precise bitterness of a man who had believed engineering was supposed to save lives. The software had a hidden override. Under certain conditions, extreme cold, heavy sensor load, specific speed, safety protocols could be bypassed. I reported it. My supervisor reported it to Sterling Cross. Cross told us to ship it anyway. And then my wife drove our daughter to school on a Tuesday morning in January, and the braking system failed on an icy overpass outside Portland. He said it flat, worn smooth by repetition, like a stone from a riverbed. But his hands gripping the desk edge were white at the knuckles. Margaret and Lily. My wife was 32. My daughter was 4. They were 6 minutes from the school when the system override engaged. The car accelerated through a red light and off the overpass. His voice remained clinical, the voice of a man who had told this story to lawyers, to reporters, to government investigators, and finally to himself in an empty cabin at 2 a.m. until the words lost their edges. The official report said driver error. Margaret had never gotten a ticket in her life. Alara said nothing. There was nothing to say. I went to the NHTSA, the press, filed a lawsuit. Sterling Cross destroyed me, fabricated evidence I'd sold data to a Chinese competitor, got my lawsuit dismissed, my license revoked, and when I wouldn't stop talking, he arranged for me to die in a boat fire, ruled accidental. But you survived. A friend warned me the night before. I had 12 hours to disappear. I took Bishop, my father's books, and the clothes on my back. He paused. Being dead is peaceful. Nobody emails you. The joke was so unexpected, so quietly human in the middle of so much darkness, that Alara's eyes stung. Caleb, if Aether integrates Omnicorp software into our entire fleet, millions of cars with a kill switch Sterling Cross controls. Yes, that's why I left you the note. You kept backups, the original data. Something shifted in his face, not trust, the beginning of the possibility of trust. There's a data center outside D.C. Omnicorp's old East Coast facility. Before I disappeared, I copied everything, testing logs, override commands, Sterling's authorization emails, onto an air-gapped server. Never connected to the internet. Can't be wiped remotely. It's been sitting there 5 years. Then we go to Washington. It's a fortress. Biometrics, armed guards, cameras on every floor. Omnicorp is hosting a gala next week, the official announcement of the Aether Omnicorp merger. Sterling invited me personally. It's at headquarters, the same building. Caleb saw where she was going. You walk in the front door. I walk in as my head of security, new hire. I've been dead 5 years. My fingerprints return a deceased flag nobody checks. They looked at each other across the cramped office of a small-town garage, and for the first time, Alara saw Caleb's face change, not to happiness, but to something older and harder. Purpose. If this goes wrong, he said, they won't just fire you, they'll bury you. If this goes wrong, people die in cars they trusted, cars I sold them, cars with my name on them. He nodded once. We leave tonight. The road trip to D.C. was 1,800 miles of paranoia, canned food, and the slow dismantling of walls they'd both spent years building. No credit cards, no digital payments, cash only. If you use a card, Caleb said, merging onto I-80, Sterling's people trace it within minutes. I know how financial surveillance works. I brief my cybersecurity team quarterly. Briefing and living are different things, princess. Stop calling me princess. Stop acting like one. Bishop stretched across the back seat with the contentment of a dog who had accepted that life now involved long car rides, yawned audibly. They slept in the truck the first night, at a rest stop in Nebraska. Alara curled in the passenger seat, Bishop claiming the back with territorial confidence. She hadn't slept in a car since college. I have a $12,000 mattress at home, she said into the darkness. Fascinating. I'm just saying, this is not that. No, Caleb agreed. This is honest. She didn't know what he meant by that, and she didn't ask, because part of her was afraid she already knew. The next day, somewhere in Iowa, they stopped for gas. While Caleb filled the tank, Alara wandered into the gas station and stopped in front of the magazine rack. Her own face stared back at her from the cover of Forbes. A photo from 6 months ago, hair perfect, expression calculated, the headline reading, "The Safest Hands in Tech." She looked at the woman on the cover and barely recognized her. That's a good picture, Caleb said from behind her, holding 2 bottles of water. That's a different person. He looked at the cover, then at her. Standing in a gas station in Iowa wearing his spare flannel because her cashmere sweater smelled like airbag propellant, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Recognition. The look of someone who understood what it felt like to become a stranger to yourself. Come on, he said. We've got 1,200 miles to go. At a motel outside Des Moines, the Prairie View Inn, $54 a night, no view of anything except a Denny's. They had exactly $200 between them. I'll handle this, Alara said, approaching the teenage desk clerk with the confidence of a woman who had negotiated a $3 billion supply contract with a South Korean semiconductor company. Your parking lot is 30% full. I'd like to propose $35, which still exceeds your marginal cost and is better than the $0 you'll earn from an empty room. The teenager stared at her. She's not wrong, Caleb said. They got the room for $40. 1 queen bed, 1 floor, and neither of them addressed this directly. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. Alara sat against the wall. Bishop took the bathroom rug, which he considered a reasonable compromise. Your negotiation skills are terrifying, Caleb said. My mother taught me. She ran the hardware store. Every customer who walked in was a negotiation. She said if you respected the transaction, you respected the person. Caleb looked at her differently after that. Not with the guarded wariness of the first days, but with recognition, the look of someone seeing a familiar shape in an unexpected place. My wife was like that, he said, and the room went very still. Margaret. She was an elementary school teacher. She could stretch a dollar further than anyone I've ever met, and she never made anyone feel poor for needing to. It was the first time he'd spoken about Margaret without armor. His voice was quiet but steady, as if he'd decided to let the words exist and see what happened. Tell me about her, Alara said. She was smarter than me. Don't tell anyone I said that. A ghost of a smile. She had a master's in education and could have run any school in the district. She chose the classroom because she said that's where the real work happened, one kid at a time. And Lily? Lily was 4. She had Margaret's eyes and my stubbornness, which Margaret said was the worst possible combination. His voice stayed even, but his hands on his knees had gone still. The way Alara had learned meant he was holding himself together by force of will. She was learning to ride a bicycle. One of those little ones with training wheels. She was terrified of falling, so she'd ride 3 feet, stop, look at me, and I'd give her a thumbs up and she'd go another 3 feet. He stopped. The room was very quiet. That's the last thing I remember clearly, the thumbs up. 3 feet at a time. Alara didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, and Caleb would have known it. She didn't reach for him, because he wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't sure she was either. She simply sat with the silence and honored the weight of it. After a while, Caleb took a breath that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. "We should get some sleep." She took the floor, he took the bed, Bishop stayed on the bathroom rug. In the dark, Alara thought about Lily on a bicycle, 3 feet at a time. She thought about the command at 11:51:47 that had nearly killed her on Teton Pass. She thought about how many Margarets, how many Lilies would be driving cars with that software if the merger went through. She was not a woman who made decisions on emotion. She was an engineer who trusted data over feeling. But lying on the floor of a $40 motel room in Iowa, she made a decision that was entirely emotional. She would burn her own company to the ground before she let Sterling Cross put another family in the ground. She fell asleep, thinking about 3 feet at a time. They reached Washington, D.C. on a Wednesday evening, 4 days after leaving Wyoming. The capital was dressed for holidays, lights on the mall, wreaths on Georgetown doors, the Washington Monument rising like a needle threading the winter sky. Caleb hadn't been in a city in 5 years. Alara watched his discomfort. The rigid focus at the wheel, the way his eyes checked every mirror, every intersection. When a taxi honked on Connecticut Avenue, his hand moved reflexively to his hip where nothing was. A ghost reflex from a life that required different preparedness. Cities have too many angles, he said. Too many places to watch from. They checked into a hotel with the last of their cash and spread a hand-drawn floor plan across the bed. The plan was simple. Caleb insisted simple was the only kind worth having. Alara would attend the gala as guest of honor. Caleb would enter as her new head of security. Once inside, he'd separate during the main event and reach the sub-basement server room. A modified transmitter he'd built from parts bought at 3 different electronics stores would push the data to every major news outlet, the NHTSA, the SEC, and the FBI simultaneously. The moment that data goes live, Caleb said, tracing the route from the ballroom to the sub-basement with his finger, Sterling loses everything. And if they catch you before you upload, then you walk out the front door and fight this in court with whatever's left of your reputation. That's not a plan. That's a suicide note. Caleb looked at her across the floor plan. Alara, if this goes wrong, they won't just fire you. They'll bury you. Your company, your reputation, your freedom. Everything you've built. If this goes wrong, people die in cars they trusted. Cars I sold them. She held his gaze. Cars with my name on them. The calculation behind his eyes completed itself. He folded the floor plan and said, "Tomorrow, you need a dress, I need a suit, and a haircut," Alara added. Caleb ran a hand over his jaw. "Don't push it." The Omnicorp Global Innovation Gala filled the 40th floor of Sterling Cross's D.C. headquarters with champagne, string quartets, and 300 people who had no idea what was about to happen. They arrived separately. Caleb entered through the service entrance 30 minutes early, credentials issued under a name that belonged to no one, wearing a suit he'd bought at a thrift store and altered himself. The carpenter's frame looked different in tailored clothes. Not elegant, but solid, competent. Earpiece, dark tie, blank expression. He could have been any private security hire in the building. Alara arrived at the front entrance in a black gown, hair pulled back, makeup minimal. Photographers called her name. She smiled for them with the practiced warmth of a woman who had been performing for cameras since before most of these journalists had their first jobs. But tonight, the smile was different. It was the smile of a woman who had come to end something. When Caleb fell into step behind her on the ballroom floor, she murmured without turning, 20 minutes. I keep Sterling talking 20 minutes. 15, Caleb said. If I need more, something's gone wrong. And if they catch you, then you walk out the front door and fight this in court. That's not a plan. That's a contingency for your death. I've been dead for 5 years. It's not as scary the second time. Sterling Cross found them before they'd finished their first lap of the room. 60s, artificial tan, expensive teeth, moving through his own party with the proprietary ease of a man who believed he owned everything in the room, including the people. Alara. He took both her hands in a gesture that was intimate enough to be uncomfortable and public enough to be photographed. You look stunning. I was worried when I heard about your little adventure in Wyoming. These electric vehicles, so unpredictable in the cold. The comment landed like a test. Alara held his gaze and didn't blink. The cold revealed some interesting data, actually. I've been meaning to discuss our integration timeline. Of course, but first, a drink. His eyes flicked to Caleb with the dismissive assessment of a man who sorted people by usefulness. And who's this? New head of security, after Wyoming, the board insisted. Smart board, can't be too careful these days. Sterling's smile didn't waver, but Alara caught it, a flicker of something when he looked at Caleb. Not recognition. Not yet. But attention. The instinct of a predator noticing movement at the edge of his vision. Caleb gave a curt nod and took position 2 steps behind Alara, exactly where a bodyguard would stand. Sterling dismissed him, the way wealthy men dismiss service staff, completely and at their own peril. For 18 minutes, Alara performed the most disciplined act of her career. She steered Sterling through market projections, regulatory landscapes, and the Chinese EV market, a subject he could monologue about indefinitely. Every question she asked was designed to hold his eyes, feed his ego, keep his back to the exits. While 40 floors below, a dead man was dismantling his empire. At minute 12, Caleb murmured, "Perimeter check," and slipped away. Sterling didn't notice. He was explaining his vision for global market dominance with the enthusiasm of a man who had never been told no. At minute 14, Alara's phone buzzed in her clutch. A text from the burner. In 3 min. She asked Sterling about supply chain logistics in Southeast Asia. At minute 17, Sterling's head of security, a thick-necked man in a dark suit, approached and whispered something in his ear. Alara watched Sterling's face change. The tan drained. The jaw clenched. For 1 second, the mask dropped entirely, and underneath was something feral, desperate, cornered. He recovered in 2 seconds. He stepped close to Alara, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that to the cameras it looked like an intimate conversation between business partners. Your bodyguard, he said softly, isn't checking the perimeter. He's in sub-basement 3. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her face showed nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me, Alara. His voice was still smiling for the room. His eyes were not. I know who he is. I've known since he walked in. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the man I spent $3 million making disappear? Then you know what he's uploading right now. My security team will stop the upload. A pause. And stop him. Permanently. He straightened his cuffs, a gesture so casual it was obscene. You have 2 options. Option 1. Walk to that podium, announce the merger, and your dead friend walks out alive. Option 2. Make a scene, and 2 people disappear tonight instead of 1. The room buzzed around them. A string quartet played Vivaldi. 300 people sipped champagne and had no idea. Alara thought about Caleb in the sub-basement. About Margaret, who was 32. About Lily, who rode 3 feet at a time. About the 115147 command hiding in millions of cars. About every family that would turn a key and trust a machine that had been designed to betray them. She walked to the podium. Sterling smiled. The room quieted. 300 faces looked up. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Alara said, her voice steady. "You've come to witness the future of transportation." Sterling nodded from the front row. "But before we talk about the future, I want to talk about the price." She looked directly at the livestream camera. The price of speed over safety. The price of burying the truth because it's inconvenient for the quarterly earnings call. "You want to see the future? Here it is." The screen behind her went black. Then it lit up with data. Not merger slides, not stock projections. Caleb's data. In the sub-basement, surrounded by security guards who'd arrived 30 seconds too late, Caleb stood with his hands raised and a transmitter plugged into the air-gapped server. He hadn't tried to run. He'd pressed the button and waited. The data didn't need him to escape. It just needed him to begin. On the screen, 5 years of buried evidence. Testing logs showing brake failures. Sterling Cross's emails ordering engineers to ship flawed software. Falsified accident reports. And at the center, one document signed by Sterling Cross himself. Override safety protocols. Approved for production release. The room erupted. Phones recording everywhere. Journalists who'd come to cover a merger were covering the scandal of the decade. Board members from both companies stared at the screen with the frozen expressions of people watching their net worth evaporate in real time. Sterling Cross stood in the front row of his own gala, watching his empire collapse on his own screen. For 5 years, he had buried a dead man's truth under lawyers and money and fabricated evidence. Now the dead man was alive. The truth was on every screen in the building, and 300 witnesses were recording it on their phones. The color left Sterling's face with the speed and finality of a man who understood that some things, once seen, could never be unseen. He turned to Alara. His mouth opened. For the first time in their acquaintance, Sterling Cross had nothing to say. "That," Alara said quietly, "is the price." Within hours, the data was on every network in the world. Omnicorp's stock lost 70% of its value. FBI agents walked into Sterling's Georgetown townhouse and led him out in handcuffs past cameras that captured the moment with the relentless appetite of a media ecosystem that loved nothing more than a powerful man brought low. Caleb was released by the FBI team that seized the servers. Questioned for 6 hours. Released. Alara met him on the steps of the Hoover building at 3 a.m. He was still in the suit, tie gone, a bruise forming on his jaw. Bishop was in the truck. His tale was audible through the closed window. "So," Caleb said. "So," Alara said, "I should probably stay dead. It's quieter. You should probably come back to life. It's warmer." He almost smiled. "I don't belong in your world. I'm not sure I belong in it either." They stood in the cold December air, two people who had started as strangers in a blizzard and ended as something that didn't have a name yet. 6 months later, Sterling Cross was in federal custody, 47 counts. Omnicorp dissolved, its name already fading. Alara had done something her board initially opposed and eventually celebrated. She'd opened Ether's entire safety testing process to public scrutiny. Every test, every result, every failure, published in real time for anyone to read. The stock dipped for 2 weeks, then climbed to its all-time high. It turned out consumers would pay a premium for the truth. She established the Margaret and Lily Thorne Foundation for Automotive Safety. Independent testing, whistleblower protection, engineering scholarships for students from families that couldn't afford MIT, because she remembered what it was like to be a girl from Allentown with grades and no money, and she wanted there to be fewer reasons for brilliant people to stay silent when they saw something wrong. The Foundation's first act was a complete review of every vehicle running software derived from Omnicorp's code. 3 million cars were called, 14 software vulnerabilities found and patched. No one died. That was the number Alara cared about. Not the stock price, not the market cap. No one died. She hadn't seen Caleb in 4 months. After that night on the Hoover building steps, he'd disappeared again. Not the desperate way of a hunted man, but the quiet way of someone figuring out what life looked like when the fight was over. He'd spent 5 years with a single purpose, survive long enough to make Sterling pay. Now, Sterling was paying, and Caleb was left with the question that comes after vengeance. What now? One text arrived 3 weeks after from the burner phone. Bishop says hello. I'm figuring things out. Don't worry. She didn't worry. Or rather, she worried exactly the right amount. Enough to check the Foundation's mail every morning. Not enough to chase a man who needed to find his own way home. On a Saturday in June, Alara left her apartment, a smaller place than before, in a building with no doorman and a coffee shop on the corner where they knew her name, and drove west, not in an Ether X, in a 1990 Ford F-150. She'd bought it at auction when the FBI released Caleb's impounded property. Had Ether's best mechanics restore it. Same dents, same scratches, same character marks that made it the truck it was. New engine, working heater. The radio still only picked up AM stations, which she decided was a feature, not a bug. She followed an address from a text that morning. A coastal town in Oregon she'd never heard of. A side street near the harbor. A garage with a hand-painted sign, Thorne and Bishop Mechanical. And underneath in smaller letters, if we can't fix it, it's not broken. She parked and watched through the open door. Caleb was crouched beside a bicycle, adjusting the chain while a girl of about 7 watched with serious eyes. 2 more kids sat on overturned buckets nearby, waiting their turn. Bishop lay in a patch of sun by the door, muzzle grayer than it had been in Wyoming, tail moving slowly in the warmth. Caleb was explaining something, gear ratios from the hand gestures, and the girl was nodding with the focused attention of a child who was learning something real from someone who knew how to teach it. 3 feet at a time. The thought hit Alara with a force she wasn't prepared for. She gripped the steering wheel and sat with it for 30 seconds, watching this man who had been dead for 5 years teach a child how a bicycle worked, the way his daughter never got to learn. She felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp pang of loneliness she'd carried for years, but something warmer and steadier, like a fire catching in a cold room. She got out of the truck. Caleb looked up. Bishop's tail accelerated. The girl on the bicycle glanced between them with the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't interested. Alara walked into the garage, reached into her bag, and pulled out a rolled-up set of blueprints. A new motor design she'd been working on for 2 months. Smaller, more efficient than anything on the market. Brilliant work, except for a thermal regulation problem she couldn't solve alone. I'm stuck on a technical issue, she said, holding out the blueprints. I need a consultant. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, stood, and took the blueprints. He unrolled them, studied the design for 10 seconds. His eyebrows rose, genuine respect. The same fraction of an inch that had once been his highest praise for her canned stew, except this time it went higher. My consulting rate is steep, he said. How steep? Dinner. There's a place on the harbor that does clam chowder in bread bowls. Bishop approves. Bishop, hearing his name, thumped his tail once in confirmation. Alara looked at Caleb Thorne, grease under his fingernails, sun on his face, children's bicycles lined up behind him like a small fleet of futures, and smiled. I've got time, she said. And for the first time in either of their lives, that was exactly, precisely, and wonderfully true. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe, because every day there's a new story waiting to find you. See you in the next one.